Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Harvard Business Review Turkey exclusive interview. It's a quite changing and challenging times for a CEO. Disruptions are everywhere. The models and the formulas we used to stick with doesn't work anymore. The needs and the expectations of each stakeholder is subject to significant changes. Thus, from performance to capability sets, everything we know about CEOs should be revisited under this context. CEO excellence, the 6 mindsets that distinguish the best leaders from the rest, is a fascinating book that seeks answers to tough questions about CEOs and CEO excellence. Today, we are more than happy to host Vik Malhotra, co-author of the book and the senior partner for McKinsey's New York office. Vik, welcome to our interview.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here, and thank you for hosting me.
Great. The pleasure is ours, Vik. Let's start with a broad question, if I may. The business world is going through a tremendous transformation, and as I have already mentioned, we have been seeing disruptions everywhere in the business arena. There are a lot of challenges and opportunities as well flourishing simultaneously. Amid this turbulence, I would like to ask the question that you already highlighted throughout the research for the book, which is, what does a CEO really do these days? What does a CEO really do these days, Vik?
Well, in many ways, what a CEO does, regardless of whether they are the very best or perfectly good CEOs, CEOs in essence have 6 major responsibilities that they have to undertake on behalf of an organization. The first responsibility is they have to set the direction for the company and be the visionary and the inspiration for where the company needs to go. So they have to set the direction for the company. Second responsibility is around aligning the organization. The third is around mobilizing through leaders. The fourth is engaging the board. The fifth is connecting with stakeholders. And the final one is obviously managing their own personal effectiveness as a leader. So all CEOs, I think, have to take on these 6 responsibilities and execute them to a high level. And in many ways, our book explores aspects of these 6 responsibilities that these CEOs take on. One point I will make, or maybe a couple of points that I'll make, is I was fascinated as we did our research that when many of these CEOs, many of these excellent CEOs take on these 6 responsibilities, I'm intrigued by the fact that many of them feel that if they can really get the energy right in terms of setting the direction of the company, get the culture issues right, get the talent equation right, mobilize through their teams in the appropriate way, if they can get all of that right, then they don't have to spend too much time in kind of dealing with the day-to-day running of the business. The business, of course, they've got to understand the issues, they've got to know the issues, they've got to be able to deal with them as they come up. But in essence, the organization should work incredibly well if they are dealing with setting the direction, getting the cultural norms right, getting the talent right, and then mobilizing appropriately through the leadership.
Vik, we have been writing a lot about CEO performance, CEO excellence as our business review. It's one of the most popular topics that we touch throughout our magazine. And as much as I know, as much as I read from the book, the idea of this book comes from a 2019 McKinsey survey as well as some other research as well. So can you just give us a little bit of the idea behind this context? Why do you think CEOs need to read such a book?
Well, as we went back in time, and we at McKinsey are continuously researching CEO excellence, leadership excellence, board effectiveness. We're always looking at those dimensions. And the statistics are pretty compelling. All right, the statistics would basically say the CEO role is very hard, right? 1/3 of all CEOs are gone within 3 years of their appointment. The tenure of a CEO has been declining. Now it's roughly somewhere between 4 and 5 years in terms of the aggregate tenure of a CEO. Many CEOs will say in their first year, they're really uncertain. 50% of them will say, we're uncertain as to whether we're really succeeding in this role. So we know that the role of the CEO is hard. Our research would also say that for excellent CEOs, the one that are truly perform at the very top, the outcomes and the impacts are huge. The benefits of extraordinary CEOs are huge. Their impact on society, the impact on job creation, and obviously the impact on shareholder value creation. And there are plenty of these statistics in the book. I won't bore you with them right now. But the job's hard, but if it's done well, the impact is enormous for society and for the shareholder. And so we wanted to write a book that really highlighted how do the very best CEOs achieve this excellent performance, particularly in the light of this being a very difficult job. So to do so, we essentially looked at the 3,500 CEOs in the world over the last 25 years globally. As we looked at these 3,500, we put two, if you like, frames on them. We said we wanted to have CEOs who'd been in role for 6 years or more so that we could really judge a real track record. And for the most part, we made a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, we wanted CEOs who had performed at the top 20% of their sector. So if they were in the financial services sector, the technology sector, or the healthcare sector, we wanted people in the top 20% in their sector. And interestingly, if you put those two lenses on the 3,500 CEOs, you quickly come down to 200 CEOs. We reached out to about 75 of the 200, fully expecting to reach out to all the 200. But we were very fortunate that 67 out of the 75 that we reached out to agreed to be interviewed for this book. So we felt that was plenty. And so our book really highlights both what our research has shown, but much more importantly, the very interesting stories from these 67 CEOs. So that's kind of the background of the book.
Yeah, it's really a good lineup. I have seen the resumes of the CEOs at the back of the book, so it's quite a lineup. So, Vik, as Harvard Business Review, we used to publish a high-performing CEOs list. I think it's one of the resources that you have already used during the research for the book. But a couple of years ago, our colleagues in Boston decided to halt this research because it's very hard to evaluate the CEO performance. There are lots of different criteria. So how should we evaluate the CEO performance regarding all the transformation, all the change going around, and who really is a top performing CEO nowadays?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I would just share with you the three insights, the high-level insights that came out, and it's the third of these insights is really what the book is all about. But the first insight I would share with you is that great CEOs take these 6 responsibilities that I described earlier. You'll recall them: set the direction, align the organization, mobilize through leaders, engage the board, connect with external stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders, and then manage your own personal effectiveness. I think the first insight was that great CEOs do all 6 of these responsibilities really well all of the time. We had gone in with the assumption that you'd have some CEOs who'd be better at one element versus another. And what we really discovered was that the very best CEOs do all 6 of these really well all of the time. So to that end, they're not the single best athlete at their sport. So they're not the Ronaldo of their sport, if you like, but they are like the best decathletes in the world. They can do a number of things really well all of the time. So that was kind of insight number 1. Insight number 2 was the burden on great CEOs to really execute on the vision for the institution and then being the integrator for the company is an incredibly important piece that great CEOs do. And Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, actually put it to us best in our interview with him. He was talking about the vision and the importance of integration. And his basic point was, he said, and I think this is a relatively accurate quote, he said, it's an information asymmetry problem. As the CEO, you see more than anyone else in your organization. No matter how much talent you have, no matter how well organized it is, you see more than anyone else in your organization. And you certainly see more than the 8 or 10 or 12 people on the board that you report to. And therefore, the burden on the CEO for the vision for the company and the integration of all the many pieces to make that vision come true is big. So that kind of is the second insight. And then the final insight, which is what the book is about in many ways, is that great CEOs don't just take these 6 responsibilities and do them, but they have a mindset around each one of these 6 responsibilities that helps them excel beyond what most CEOs do. So, for example, when it comes to setting the direction of the company, the mindset is be bold, be bold. How can you really think outside the box, think in big, bold, meaningful ways that really pushes the institution beyond where it might naturally go without the kind of boldness of mindset that you might bring to it. So, and we can explore this further if you like, but it's these 6 different mindsets that come against these 6 responsibilities that to us was a very interesting set of findings as we did our interviews.
Right. Can we just dig down a little bit more on these 6 responsibilities or attributes? What are some common attributes of successful CEOs that differentiates them from the others?
Well, if you think about this responsibility of set the direction and the mindset of be bold, let me give you a couple of interesting examples that certainly was very interesting to us as we went through it. On the first place that they really start is they tend to be real visionaries. And so they don't just think about the next level for the organization, but they think about where could this organization truly go. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Ajay Banga at MasterCard, when he took over MasterCard, its market cap was $18 billion. When he handed it off 9 years later, its market cap was almost $300 billion. And when Ajay came in to look at the vision of the company, everyone was talking about beat Visa, be the best payments company you can be. And Ajay looked around in 2011 and said 85% of all transactions are still in cash. And he changed the vision of the company to say, kill cash, kill cash. And that gave the company permission to invest behind the debit card business, to kind of think about the electronification of cash. And that really created the impetus for this enormous growth that MasterCard enjoyed over that 9-year period. Herbert Hainer comes in as the CEO of Adidas, and he recognizes that they are not excelling in terms of products and capabilities that they're delivering to their customers. And so he came up with a vision which said, I want to help great athletes perform even better. And initially the organization felt, well, what does that mean in terms of a vision? But what it really translated into was we wanted a whole different level of boldness in terms of product excellence, customer experience, and the like. So these great CEOs come in with a real mindset around a profoundly different vision for the company. The other aspect that's very important when it comes to being bold is around resource allocation. So what we learned again through our interviews was these great CEOs really kind of think very hard about capital allocation, expense allocation, and talent allocation. And in many ways, they own it. They will not default where capital investment goes and where expense investment goes to their CFO or their business unit leaders. They very much believe that this is something that they should own in a major way, right? So those are just some examples of how they are bold. They're bold about the vision, they're bold about how they allocate capital, and they really bet hard against the things that they believe will make the company distinctive going forward. So that's just one example. And obviously that's one mindset. We can obviously touch upon some of the other mindsets as well. I particularly like the mindsets they brought to culture and talent, and you will guide me, but I'd be happy to talk about those as
Sure,
well.
sure. That's the question that I'm about to ask you, Vik. The other mindsets. Please go ahead and tell us around the 6 mindsets.
Right. So we talked about the mindset of be bold with set the direction. When it comes to aligning the organization, the mindset that you hear from these CEOs is very much around treat the soft stuff as the hard stuff. And what do they mean by that when they kind of talk about treat the soft stuff as the hard stuff? What it really means is that they think about culture and talent no differently than they think about budgets and resource allocation. They believe that cultural attributes and talent attributes. You can have metrics against them, you can measure them, you can role model them, you can build capabilities around them, you can pay people on them, you can communicate against them. And so they really manage those if I can almost call it hard ways, just like they might manage a budget. And this really allows them to have distinctive cultures and distinctive practices when it comes to talent. Two other points I would make on this. On culture, one of the things that you hear from them is in big companies, it is very hard to move culture in major ways. And so therefore, pick on the one or two attributes of culture that you really want to migrate and focus hard on doing that by putting metrics on it, putting measurements on it, and making it come alive to the organization. So let me give you one quick example to bring that to life for you. Kaz Hirai at Sony. Kaz Hirai at Sony knew that Sony had to really move from being perfectly good in the entertainment business, in the electronics business, in the financial services business, from being perfectly good on product development, had to move to just being at the bleeding edge in terms of the experience that it delivered to its customers. And so he said, culturally, we need to deliver kando. Kando in Japanese, loosely translated, is the wow factor. We need to deliver the wow factor. And he put some real metrics around what it meant to deliver the wow factor. And for 3 years, he wandered around 65 countries, talking day in and day out about kando, kando, kando. And he shifted the whole orientation of the company, which allowed it to excel in many ways. So again, bringing some really hard measures against a soft attribute in culture, he was able to really shift the culture of Sony in many ways. And you see this time and time again with these excellent CEOs. They also do it on talent. On talent, they think very hard about what are the 50, 100, 200 jobs in the company that really will move the shareholder price disproportionately. In essence, they come to a conclusion that there are 200 roles in a company that really matter more than any other. And they will figure out what those roles are. And then very importantly, they will put their very best people into those roles. So again, just some examples about how they kind of think about culture and talent and how they treat what are typically soft things, culture and talent, very much like they might treat a budget or resource allocation.
Vik, to achieve CEO excellence, there is a significant need for a change in the mindset of the boards and shareholders. How do you see the pace of this mindset shift?
Yes, I would agree with the hypothesis behind your question, which is, for the most part, if you look globally, the governance and the work between the board and the CEO and the rest of the management team doesn't work great. Our research, which is not in this book, but just separately, would suggest that for the most part, that relationship is fine, but it's not distinctive. I think one of the things we discovered with these great CEOs when it comes to boards is they really have this mindset around boards, which is, how do I help our directors help the business? And I would just call out 3 things that the CEOs and the boards in great companies are increasingly doing. The first is they work very hard. The CEO works very hard with usually the board chair or the lead director, depending on how the governance is set up, to make sure that the company has the right people on the board for what the company needs going forward. The problem with many boards today is that they are composed of either friends and family, or they're composed of people who have a skill set that is for what the company needed in the last generation, not in the future world. So if in the future the board needs more technology skills, more marketing skills, more governance skills, more regulatory skills, one of the things we're finding is that increasingly the very best performing boards are working well with the CEO to really make sure that the right talent is on the board. So that's number one. Number two, they work really hard to make sure that there's a real openness between the CEO and the board in terms of what's working and what's not working. what one of the CEOs that we interviewed, Roger Ferguson, called radical transparency with the board is critical. One of my favorite stories is from Ivan Menezes, who's the CEO of Diageo, who has a practice that he calls 7+7. So he starts every board meeting in an executive session where he brings the board members together just with him. And he says, here are the 7 things that have worked really well since I was last with you. And here are the 7 things that are keeping me up at night. And that practice of 7+7 just creates complete radical and open transparency with the board, which then allows them to really kind of feel comfortable that they've got all the issues on the table. And then the final thing that great CEOs are increasingly doing is they're tapping in onto the wisdom of the elders, of the people on the board, both for what they as the CEO can do, getting their input, but also making sure that those board members have access to the management team. And so increasingly, I'm seeing that really well-functioning boards and CEOs are doing these 2 or 3 things really well, and that's making a difference. And of course, that requires a change in behavior from the CEO, and it requires a change in behavior from the board members, and indeed sometimes a reconstitution of the composition of the board to really make that happen. So that gives you a sense on the board. I think from an investor point of view, look, the shareholder obviously has a lot of demands on the company in terms of what the shareholder wants from a return point of view, and that's completely acceptable. I will say that these CEOs really understand that they've got to deliver against the shareholder demands and the shareholder returns. That's clear to them. But they're also very good at seeing through the short term and not overly focusing on the quarterly returns on an ongoing basis. They realize if they're going to be bold in their vision, if they realize if they're going to try and make some big things happen for the company, that sometimes they're going to have to see through and past next quarter and the second quarter's earnings and really take the long-term view, what Larry Fink at BlackRock calls long-term capitalism. So let me leave it at that.
So, Vik, last but not least, you have tapped into the minds of many different CEOs. You have done a substantial research. So, about the future, how will the CEO role evolve in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The CEO role, in many ways, I think the 6 responsibilities and the 6 mindsets that we've laid out, I very much hope these are timeless. I think in many ways they applied 20 years ago, and I'm very hopeful they will apply 20 years from now. However, I think as we look forward, in my mind, there are 2 or 3 things that are going to be fundamentally different. Firstly, I think as we all recognize, the pace of change is much faster than anything CEOs have historically seen. Technology change, geopolitical change, the demands externally, the visibility today that CEOs have because of social media relative to what they ever had. So the demands in the context of being a CEO are changing dramatically. And therefore, I think one of the things that will be different going forward is that CEOs will increasingly need to make decisions with less information and more judgment than they had historically. 20 years ago, you could take your time to do the analysis, get all the data in place, then make the decisions. Today, the world is moving way too fast. Yes, you've got to get the data. Yes, you've got to do the analysis. But increasingly, I think the context of the world and the speed of the world is going to mean that CEOs are going to have to make judgments and make decisions based on imperfect information. And this will put an increasing burden on CEOs. So that's one thing I think that'll be different. I think a second thing that's going to be different is everything that they need to do in terms of mobilizing through leaders. One of the big messages we got from the CEOs was how important it is now in today's world not to just have star members of your team. So it's not just about having stars on your team, but it's actually having a star team, a team that really comes together and works well together. So I think the burden on making sure that CEOs really bring their leadership team together, have them work collaboratively, have them work effectively as a unit so that they are stronger as a whole than they are individually, I think that burden has gone up. And then I think the final change that I think is fundamentally different from 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago is just the external demands. If the external demands on a CEO were 5 or 10% historically, in today's world, it's increasingly 30% of their time is spent on, increasingly 30% of their time is spent externally. And as a result, CEOs are increasingly thinking about how are they spending their time, how are they putting their time in this external factor, how do they really make sure that they're spending that wisely, whether it's with investors, analysts, regulators, trade unions, dealing with war in Ukraine, dealing with pandemic issues, all of this external burden has gone up dramatically, and I only see it accelerating. And so some wise choices on how they spend time will be increasingly important.
Vikram, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your insights. CEO Excellence, the 6 mindsets that distinguish the best leaders from the rest, is a fascinating book. I hope this book will be a guideline or a guide for any leader that are trying to achieve more and more success in this very ever-changing era. Thank you very much, Vik.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.